Hey guys, we'll start in a minute.
A few people have texted me saying that they might be a little bit late. Maybe we just wait for 1 or 2 minutes more. We start at 7:02. Okay.
Professor Wang, how are you doing in Singapore, by the way?
Oh, I'm all right. I mean, as you know, Singapore is in the middle of a very turbulent area, both because of the pandemic and because of the coup in Myanmar. So we have our local problems keeping us busy. None of it easy to solve. They all got a long-term effects which we have to get used to.
Indeed.
That includes Hong Kong, incidentally.
Exactly, and the situation in Hong Kong is also quite worrying, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, so actually now we already have 170 participants. Maybe we shall begin. Okay. Good morning, everyone, for those in Europe and United States, and good evening to those in Asia. Welcome to the first joint seminar between the LSE China Forum and the Washington University St. Louis China Forum. Today, we are extremely delighted to have Professor Wang Gungwu joining us from Singapore and Dr. Po joining us from London. Before I begin to introduce the speakers, let me say a few words about the two organizations. So the LSE China Forum was initiated by several LSE's alumni in 2015, focusing on China's economic, political, social, and cultural developments. So we have monthly and weekly seminars on Zoom, and we also have a major two-day conference in Shanghai or Beijing in every year September. But this year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we might not be able to. We are still trying to figure out how do we go about doing the major forum. And now let me invite Serena to briefly introduce her organization.
Hello, everyone. I'm Serena from the WashU China Forum. WashU China Forum was founded in 2018 at Washington University in St. Louis. We have worked with experts on some of the most prestigious institutions, such as Brookings Institutions, the Granville Institution, American Enterprise Institute, Beijing, and Tsinghua University, to serve as a resource for future leaders of all backgrounds who wish to engage China's emergence on the global stage. I'm deeply honored to have Professor Wang with us today. Yeah, and I'll pass the time back to Jackson.
Yeah, actually, Professor Wang needs no introduction, but for the sake of those who are joining us for the first time, I'll just say a few words about Professor Wang's life. Professor Wang was born in Indonesia and raised in Malaya. And then he studied in Nanjing during the Chinese Civil War before he returned. He came to Singapore to study at the University of Malaya, and then he went to the University of London to get his PhD. After that, he served in numerous organizations in universities, such as the Australian National University, as the director of the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies, and the Vice Chancellor of the University of Hong Kong. And after that, he came to Singapore to become the chairman of the East Asian Institute and the chairman of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. that was where I met Professor Wang for the first time in the East Asian Institute. I still remember he was seated right in front of me, and it was not until the 5th time I met him I had the courage to talk to him. So for those of you who are interested to find out more about Professor Wang, actually Professor Wang has produced almost 30 books since 1999. And the most recent one being Home is Where We Are in 2020, China Reconnects in 2019, and Home is Not Here in 2018. So for those of you who are interested, please go and purchase the book. You'll definitely love them. and Dr. Ronald C. Poe is an associate professor of Chinese history at the London School of Economics. He's the author of a prize-winning book entitled The Blue Frontier, Maritime Vision and Power in the Qing Empire. In 2019, he was elected a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. So before we invite Professor Wang, let me just quickly talk about the flow of today. So we will begin by a 20-minute speech by Professor Wang, and then after that, a 30 minutes moderated discussion with Serena, our moderator for today. And after that, a 20-minute comment section by Dr. Poe. And then after that, we'll open up for Q&A, a 30-minute Q&A. For those of you who have a question, please type them in the chat box and I will select them. So now, without further ado, let us welcome Professor Wang Gungwu, please.
Thank you very much, Jackson and Serena and Ronald. I'm delighted to be part of this new enterprise of yours. I think it's an extremely good idea. And if I were young again, I would join in straight away. And there's obviously a lot to learn. You've picked on a very big subject. I must say that this is not just a historical subject, but the recent history, the last 150 years of history, both in China and in the West, it's really transformed the world. And so we are talking about a major transformation globally in all its consequences, but very specifically now, we're faced by the tensions between the two powers, the United States and China. For China, of course, I can't say that we can deal with this subject in one go, but let me say that I assume that most of you have a broad outline of what happened in the last 150 years. So I won't go into any of the details. But what I will do is I'll be quite arbitrary in selecting what I consider to be some of the most important aspects of that transformation, which still has resonance today and probably even directly relevant to some of the problems that we face today and the reasons for tensions between the United States and China. This is my selection, and I'm very open to other ideas, and I would welcome your suggestions as to what else I should be paying more attention to. Let me briefly pick on 3 of them. I will just concentrate on these 3. The first is very obvious to everyone, obvious to the Chinese, and obvious to the United States, and that is a question of wealth and power. But this is nothing new. The whole of history, countries, empires, nations, monarchies, whatever you have them, all kinds of political units, the polities, states, face this problem of wealth and power. Most of the time, of course, it's enough to look after their own interests, but every now and then, when there's an shall we say, an extra power or extra wealth, a surplus of wealth and power, there's a temptation to expand, that other countries expand. And this is, again, normal throughout history. So it's no surprise that in the 19th century, when the power that the West by that time had acquired by complete domination of the oceans from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the fact that they had actually proven naval power that dominated the world, that power should have its impact on China. And of course, faced with that, the question of China, not that it was not capable of producing a similar kind of naval power, but they had, in a way, neglected it or thought it was not really essential except for local defense, coastal defense, and the region immediately around it. But even then, not paying a great deal of attention, because the long traditions of the history of China has been to to face the fact that their most important enemies have come from overland. And it was a continent that was much more important to them. And of course, particularly because the dynastic power of the Manchu, being a continental people themselves, and all their partners, like the Mongols and others, were also continental in their outlook, that they should also concentrate on that and not pay adequate attention to the naval defenses of the empire. So that is pretty obvious. And it was obvious to China that it was a failure to defend their coastal lines from naval power of people who are ambitious to expand their influence and their controls, that they began to feel the sense of, in a way, helplessness and the need to urgently try and catch up. And as you can see, the first few decades after the First Opium War, the imperial bureaucrats concentrated a lot of attention on trying to build up, catch up on the naval gaps in their system. But of course, fundamentally, the Qing Empire was so confident of themselves that it didn't really see this defeat in the Opium Wars as an existential threat to them. It was irritation, it was a trouble to them, and they had to make concessions, which they deeply regretted later on, but they did not actually see it as an existential one. It was something they could catch up. It was a technological one. It was a need to pay more attention to military build-up, particularly to build up the Navy. And they did pay a lot of attention to that for a while. But again, not seriously enough, because they were still faced with what their traditional problems were. Internal rebellions, and of course one can mention the Taiping Rebellion, which is a very exceptional one, and which was of course linked to the arrival of these foreigners by sea. But there were also other internal rebellions, whether it's the Nian and the rebellions in Yunnan. But in particular, the major rebellions were in Xinjiang, in the northwest. And this cost them a fantastic amount of money and manpower throughout the 19th century. It was something that we should not forget. It was a major threat. And to them, that was much more serious, much more important, and they paid a lot of attention to that, and much less attention to even their own recognition that they needed to strengthen their naval power. As a result, when it came to a test, and they challenged the Japanese Navy in the 1890s, they were thoroughly defeated. I won't go into the reasons for that, they're pretty obvious, but the fact was, it's not that the Chinese did not know this was a major problem. They knew it was, but they didn't quite accept the fact that this is possibility, the possibility of this threat being of existential difficulty in the future. But as it turned out, by the 1890s, it was clear this was an existential problem, not only to the dynasty, but actually to the whole system of values, ideas, political institutions, just about everything you can think of was now on the table for discussion by other people who will now dictate terms. And of course, the climax was the Boxer Rebellion, and by which time, basically the game was over. And the feeble attempts to reform were too little too late, as everyone knew. And they had to face the reality that the people in the country turned against them. And insofar as the so-called 1911 revolution was a revolution, it was a revolution against the dynastic state as such, against the Manchus and the dynastic state as such. And that itself was driven by the fact that a whole group of people, particularly in the South, had learned from the West of political institutions that they considered to be superior to the kind of dynastic state that they've had for thousands of years. So that major, you might say, political transformation had already occurred in the minds of people, but it was a long way from actually a reality. It was simply a lot of young people excited by the possibility of getting rid of the dynastic system altogether and replacing by something that would catch up with the West, not only in military terms, but in civilizational, political, structural, social, cultural, economic, all sorts of areas where they found themselves behind. So that's number one. Power and wealth clearly behind, obvious to all Chinese. The second one I want to pay attention to is something a little bit less obvious and something much more ambiguous in the Chinese mind. And this is a question of law. I emphasize this because in a way, when we concentrate on the Opium War being something about opium, I think we're missing the point. To a large extent, it was about law. It's about law pertaining to business. It was a law about foreigners in China. It was a law about foreigners being able to do business in China along their own lines and not be subject to all the completely, to the West anyway, uncivilized systems of law that was prevailing at the time. So as a result of which, in the treaties, early treaties, all these issues of extraterritoriality, dissension of Hong Kong, for example, was obviously a question of sovereignty, which was already brought in. I think the Chinese were simply not aware how serious these were in the minds of the West. To them, these were legal issues, are pretty sacred as they saw it. And to the Chinese, law was something you can negotiate, and if circumstances change, you can renegotiate and look at it again. Their tradition of law is so different that this was such a difficult issue for the West and the Chinese to come to any agreement about. And I think when you look back on it, those treaties, as important as victories at sea, the victories at sea were obvious, but the long-term effects of those treaties on extraterritoriality, on questions of sovereignty, of the nature of the empire itself, what kind of empire we were talking about, and how do the foreign powers make the Chinese play by the international rules, the international law that they had devised for everybody, whoever they dealt with. And of course, they were gaining in power all that time in the 19th century. And then by that time, having dominated most of Asia, they were definitely insistent that these rules should apply because they were the rules of civilized nations. And if you don't apply them or don't accept them, you are less than civilized. And this was a major challenge to the Chinese, that they should even be considered as less civilized than the West. But this question of law then becomes a kind of marker as to what extent you are worthy of being treated as an equal. And of course, the whole question of not having a foreign office, not having foreign relations even the ministry of the government, and having to reinvent, as it were, a whole system of dealing with foreigners, which was separate from the tributary system that they had inherited from the past, was a major challenge to them, which they didn't quite understand. My reading of it is they didn't quite understand the seriousness of it, that this was actually undermining the whole of their set of assumptions about how to deal with non-Chinese people. But the real test, I would say the first test of how serious this was the way the Japanese took advantage of it in Taiwan. First of all, in the early days in 1874, in so forth, advancing their interest in Taiwan, and later on, of course, at the end of the war, actually taking over of Taiwan, and the interventions in Korea. All these were actually direct challenges to what the Chinese began to realize were a full rejection of a system of defense and commerce that had been serving them very well for hundreds of years. By that time, it was too late. But this underlying fact about law and international law is so fundamental because it raises this question of sovereignty, of what is an empire, what is a nation, who is civilized enough to have the law applied to them and applied to them as on equal terms as with the West. And because they're not civilized enough, they're not equal. Then different rules have to apply. And if you don't observe them, then the West and the civilized powers have the right to intervene by force. And this takes me to the third point. The third area, of course, and this stretching from the extraterritoriality and the protection of these foreigners on Chinese soil, led them, of course, to the question of Chinese values. Very fundamental now. This is a deep structure problem. The deep structure of Chinese society, what they believe in, what makes them Chinese, and things which they have taken for granted in many ways, but they're very, very proud of. Insofar as the West did not challenge that directly, but simply asked for certain rights. For example, I just give this one example, there are many others. Law was one, of course, I've already given that one. But the second one is the bringing forth of missionary work, which is, of course, couched in very, very civilized terms, to bring education, to bring health, hospitals, modern medicine, modern knowledge through translation efforts and so on, and bringing, of course, at the same time, the mission to transmit some of the excellent, wonderful, and unique values of Christianity to people who don't understand it. This was, of course, not new to the Chinese. The Chinese have been aware of this Christian mission from the 15th, 16th century with the Jesuits and so on. But at that point, there was no question of extraterritoriality, because the Jesuits came and did whatever was necessary to try and persuade the Chinese of the strength of their faith. But this time round, this became associated with both the law, extraterritoriality on the one hand, and by the fact that the West, as a civilized power, could intervene to protect the rights of these missions and to line up the missions with, as it were, gunships. The gunships could go up and down and could be used when anything went wrong to the missions. Now, this was something new to the Chinese. They have accepted foreign religions before, whether it's Buddhism or Islam. There are problems here and there now and again, but it was never associated with the right of any powers outside that, in the name of protecting their civilizing mission, can actually intervene and directly force the Chinese to accept whatever those missions were bringing to China. To relate a religious faith to wealth and power, so to speak, and to tie it to law and extraterritoriality, these three combined was then really a challenge, not only an existential challenge to the state, but it's existential to the civilization, to the whole heritage of values that the Chinese have been so proud of. And of course, their response was basically irrational in many cases, and they did tremendous damage to themselves by not knowing how to handle this question, and really no communication between what the state understood was the issue and what the ordinary people felt about these missionaries wandering around among them, preaching their faith, which is in itself perfectly innocent, and even, in fact, with very good intentions and well-meaning. But insofar as people did not understand or misunderstood, or in fact found it absolutely unacceptable, then of course the irrational behavior led to the tragedies at the end of the century. But taken together, these three, I think, made something really, made it almost impossible for a real understanding between China and the West. And you can see by the end of the 19th century, the Chinese spoke in terms of China and the West. It's all bilateral, as it were. China representing a civilization, and the West representing a different civilization, but one that they respected, because when it was clear after the Boxers that the game was over as far as the dynastic state was concerned, the reforms were inadequate, and the people rose, and a willingness to accept a completely new system, a republican state, a nation state. The idea was completely new, very fresh. And as you all know, Sun Yat-sen complained that the Chinese people didn't understand what it meant to have a nation, to have a national a sense of nationhood. And he had a hard time preaching just simple idea of a nationhood to the Chinese people, least of all, the idea of a republic. So all this was so new that they really could not quite grasp it for a long while. And you can say that the first half of the 20th century was a major struggle by some of the most brilliant people in China to try and reconcile some of these challenges to what China, as a modernizing force, as they want to modernize China, as they want to catch up and take what they can out of the West to make China strong again and to recover its self-respect and so on, and to save its civilization even in the deep structure of the civilization to keep themselves Chinese, to link it up with a kind of pride in nationhood and pride in the Chinese people. All that was a major struggle. And you can see the efforts were inadequate, unconvincing, in fact, to a lot of people. And it took many more decades of serious struggle, but helped ultimately by the fact of the Japanese invasion. I mean, in a way, thanks to the Japanese invasion, I think the final message of the need to have national pride, the national interests are sacred, and the idea that the only way you can do that is to be prepared to give your life up for the sake of your country. All these ideas then began to surface and attracted more and more young people into the whole idea of changing totally the Chinese worldview and take on the modernization process almost in every respect. The willingness to do that was there. But as it turned out, and you can go into this in great detail, but I won't do that now. What I'll do now is to just go back to these three and look at how it faces us today. If you look at the present situation, to go back to the question of values. I mean, I'm sorry, to go back to the question of China as a nation, as opposed to Chinese empire. Words like this. In one sense, it wasn't a terribly difficult one. What was new, and it was new to everybody, including the West itself. As you all know, the idea of nation really emerged only in the 17th and 18th century. In the 17th century, through the Treaty of Westphalia, there was some idea of nationhood, but it was still largely in terms of equal sovereign states, including monarchies, all kinds of states, religious principalities, all sort of strange remnants of the old empires of the Holy Roman Empire and so on, and the feudal systems. And nothing like what was happening elsewhere. But even that, for them, it was new. But the fact was, out of that emerged a new kind of empire. And nobody else had ever seen that before. And that is a national empire. Now, on the surface, this looks like a contradiction in terms, but it wasn't, because up to that point, empires had commercial interests, they had kind of expansionist interests, just a matter of territorial expansion, and ways and means of dealing with people who do not belong to your own ethnic group or even your own religion, finding ways and means of gaining their loyalty and making them subjects of the emperor. And it didn't matter terribly what nationality or ethnic group or even religion or language they spoke. That was an old kind of empire. But the empire that emerged by the 1800 or so was a national empire. In many ways, it started a little bit earlier with the Dutch, but they didn't quite define it that way. But once you had the French Empire and the British Empire that followed the French and fought each other in the 19th century as national empires, both as it were representing the nation state of France and a kind of new national consciousness of the British people in the United Kingdom, then they were setting out to build empires which were peculiar to them as a people, as the citizens of a nation. That sense of identification with the nation had emerged, and the empire was something that belonged to that nation. Now that was completely new, and this totally not understood. I mean, if you put it in those terms, you would have to say the Qing dynasty was not an ordinary empire, it was a Manchu empire. It belonged to the Manchus, but there was no such thing. The Manchu did not have a sense of nationality. On the contrary, they adopted a lot of things that were peculiar to the Chinese and happily used them as a means of staying in power, expanding their interest, while keeping some Manchu cultural traits, their whole military system, and using that to expand their continental interests together with the Mongols as their partners or as their allies. So it was a completely different sense of empire. But now the Chinese never really, even the Qing, never really thought of themselves as any kind of national empire. And this is where some of these terms become very important. Let me give you a further example of this. And what happened was, when the Qing dynasty fell, the question of whether to write the Qing, the Chinese tradition had done that for every dynasty. Of course, from the point of view of the Republic, this didn't make any sense. They didn't recognize This is not China in the proper sense. These are the Han Chinese had finally got their own country back, and Sun Yat-sen and the early revolutionaries were doing, after all, in the name of getting rid of the Manchus. But interestingly enough, when they came to the power after 1911, in fact, even before that, they began to be conscious of the fact that this was not quite so simple. It was not a question of getting rid of the Manchus alone. It was inheriting the territory, which is the Qing Empire. And the irony of it all was that in terms of the international law of the time, everybody was a bit vague and and because of the conflicts and competition and rivalries among the Western powers, there was a willingness to accept that when the Manchus abdicated their power and handed over the heritage of the Qing Empire to Yuan Shikai as the president of the republic, that was considered to be a legitimate act, legitimizing the republic and allowing the West to recognize the Republic of China as a successor state to the Qing Empire. Whatever they understood by that, how exactly it was defined by some of the countries, we are not very sure, and they were pretty confused about it anyway. The main thing was the Chinese took that as the basis on which the republic's legitimacy and sovereignty would be built. But those are the foundations of this new republic, inheriting the territory of the Qing state when the Manchus gave way to the presidency of Yuan Shikai. And it was on that basis that thereafter the question of territoriality, sovereignty, and legitimacy was based. Now that, of course, raises new questions today. And the question today is a very simple one. What is China? Is China a nation state, or is it the remnants of an empire? And this, on the surface, sounds like an academic argument, but it isn't, because although academics are arguing about this among themselves, the fundamental position is that by the end of the Second World War, when the New World Order was being shaped, as started through the League of Nations, to the United Nations, it was agreed among the great powers with the end of empires that the Americans were very happy to support, and very happy the Soviet Union, the Russians were very happy to support, at the end of empires. All these old national empires had to give way to nation states. And of course, all the countries that sought independence from these national empires were very happy to have this opportunity to gain their independence and their freedom from colonial rule by inheriting the colonial state and making it the basis of their nation states, even though they had never had nation states before. And as you can see, all over Asia, Africa, but in particular, these two regions, the attempts to build this idea of a nation has been really very painful. And it's still going on. It is still work in progress, and it's by no means easy to solve, even right now, after nearly 80 years since the end of World War II. But nevertheless, that was a structure that was agreed, a United Nations structure. And this was a completely different set of principles. And in many ways, particularly for small countries, new countries which are just being built, it was extremely important structure because it allowed these little countries, nations that were still in the process of building themselves, to be protected, that their sovereignty was respected because they were recognized nation states, member states of the United Nations organizations, and that in principle, every state, every nation was equal. Now this is extraordinary and something that never been known before. Even in Europe was very recent. In fact, as you can see, they were still struggling with this right down to the collapse of the Soviet Union when they created a new nation state. And even then, they were arguing how many nation states Yugoslavia should become, how many nation states Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia became two, all that. So you can see that this is still not all that resolved. And in Asia, of course, we're even more conscious of it. I mean, where I live in Southeast Asia, these borders are really very new. And even a country like Singapore and Malaysia, we changed our borders several times in the course of 30 or 40 years. So these are issues which are still, as it were, alive, and people are still building on the basis of newly drawn up borders and struggling to deal with the ethnic minorities and all the people who don't quite accept the system as left behind by the colonial powers. So we are still in the process of a pretty fluid situation, in my view, although the structure has been given. And this is crucial. Let's go back to the structure. It comes from wealth and power. It was a structure built by power, by the supreme dominant power of the West, in particular, Western Europe and United States, who won, the states that won the Second World War. That's number one. Number two, it was built on a system of international law that was first devised entirely for European states with the Treaty of Westphalia, Congress of Vienna, and so on, but actually then gradually extended beyond their territories into their empires. When their national empires drew up boundaries of what was the British Empire, what was the French Empire, but each of these French empires, British Empire, were in a way sovereign in their own right. But the new system now said, no, you can't have empires as states. You have to go back to your nations. So then each of these countries, national empires, had to abandon, walk away, decolonize, and go home to their own state. Now that became the formula. It became the dominant discourse of modern historiography, that the modern history is based on the idea that empires all fade away one after the other and are replaced by nation states. And that this becomes, as it were, the basic rule backed by the United Nations and international law as it has been applied since 1945. Now, that is the new system, the new world order, so to speak. I'm not sure that the Chinese leaders at any point found themselves comfortable with that. I mean, Sun Yat-sen may have talked about Minzuzuyi as nationalism and try to get around this problem by devising the phrase Zhonghua Minzu to apply to all the ethnic groups that live within the boundaries of the Republic, and all sorts of ways to try and, in a way, resolve this problem that the Chinese Republic was a new nation state that succeeded the Qing state, except that in the eyes of the West and in the eyes of international law in some ways, the Qing state was a Qing empire and was a Manchu empire. But the difference was, and this is so important to the Chinese framework, that the Manchu empire did not see themselves as a national empire. The Manchus actually became Chinese in the sense that they became Sinified. The Manchuria itself, they didn't have a home to go back to by 1911. And by 1911, Manchuria was already, the majority of people in Manchuria were Han Chinese. So they had no home to go back to. Of course, the Japanese tried to help them to create a Manchu court that they could call their own and then turn all the Chinese there into citizens or subjects of the Manchu court. But, well, fortunately for the Chinese, and because of Japanese errors and mistakes, that did not happen, did not succeed. And at the end of the Pacific War, the West actually recognized the Republic of China as a sovereign state, which and accepted that the borders were one more or less, and there were some vagueness about it, but more or less as given in 1911. The exception was, of course, Mongolia, but there were other little details here and there, but nevertheless, that was accepted. Now that created a particular problem for the Chinese today. And today when I hear arguments within China as well as outside, what is China? This is crucial because it touches on the question of China's power and wealth now is based on the territory they inherited from the Qing state, with the exception of Mongolia, and now with the exception of Taiwan up to now. And the fact was, this was what they, in their own minds, was the complete unification of China meant that China, because that was what they were. That was what was determined in 1912 when the Republic of China was created. But as you can see, the question of ethnic groups having self-determination as their basis, as taking as a European example of all the creation of all the nation states out of empires, whether the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, all ended up more or less one way or the other, something like that. Or for that matter, the whole Ottoman Empire in Africa and Asia as well, all more or less ended up in that way. Each of them, in some ways, helped by both the British and the French to define new nation states out of these remnants of the empire. So there, when you look back in that way, then the historians, given the discourse, modern discourse, as determined by the 1945 New World Order that has encouraged all historians to rewrite history in the format of empires becoming nations, then you can look at China and say there are ethnic groups there that are already nations. And these ethnic groups should not be part of China. In effect, they should be allowed to determine their own fates. This goes against the Chinese tradition. And this is a serious problem because the Chinese tradition was that their China had no borders. Their China was not defined by ethnic groups. Their China was never defined by anything except what the core areas of China, bearers of the old ancient civilization, was able to control at any one time. And the ups and downs of these dynasties are well known to all of us. And it expands, it contracts, it divides into 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it becomes one again, with always the ultimate expectation of the ideal world is for it to be united under a civilizational concept of the Confucian legalist state, which became, in the eyes of the Chinese, the basic model of China. And that China, as I said, shrank and expanded several times. In fact, it fell. You can even argue that China fell and rose again, fell and rose again. And by the 13th century, the whole of China was actually under foreign rule for the first time. There was no China. You can't even identify China under Mongol Yuan. All of it was under a Mongol ruler, Kublai Khan and his successors. And it took quite a major revolution to get rid of the Mongols and to, in fact, to go on fighting to defend China against the Mongols for another few centuries before the Manchus took over. So that China has been, as it were, a problem for the Chinese people, whoever they were at the time. And none of it was based on territory, and none of it was based on any idea of nationhood, sovereignty, and so on. The legitimacy was the success in the battlefield, or whoever won, and won the mandate of heaven, as conceived in the Chinese political culture of the Tianxia and the Son of Heaven. That kind of one sun in the sky, or one sun in the heaven idea was the basis on which they have succeeded over the last 3,000 years or so. And in the course of which, of course, they had worked out their own historical discourse. Those historical discourse was based on the one hand, a set of classics, supposedly derived from people like Confucius and the philosophers of the 100 schools, and on the other, by the fact that it was unified under Qin Shi Huang, and then followed by the Han, to be into a unified empire of a centralized bureaucratic state. Now these are the two traditions, and of the Confucian Qing, followed by the actual establishment of a state, an empire, which eventually drew on the Confucian classics to support the legalist structure that was created by Qin Shi Huang. And between the two, they have actually survived many, many threats to them, invasions from the Xiongnu, invasions from the Xianbei, invasions from the Turks and Tibetans, and then finally Manchus, Mongols, the Jurchen, the Khitan, the Mongols, the Tanguts, all these invasions. And in the end, with the Ming dynasty, by the time you get to the Ming dynasty, the Han reappear. And how they reappear, it's a long story, but they reappear as inheritors of the Qin Han and Tang traditions. That's what they said. The Ming emperor described themselves as inheritors. That has been based on the simple fact, a historical fact, that in support of the Qing, there was Shi. And Shi did not mean history as we understand it today. Shi was the totality of records kept by the state from the time, at least in so far as we have it, from Shi Ji. But you can say you can go back to the Zhuoduan, the three interpretations of the spring and autumn annals, but it's a Shiji that represents the beginning, and then the Hanshu, and that became the basis of a model of a Shi tradition that has been carried down right to the Qing dynasty. And of course, as you know, as a result of which those records reached the Ming dynasty, and it was confirmed in particular, very significant, that the Yuan dynasty actually confirmed that the Liao, Jin, and the Song were legitimate dynasties of China. They are part of that same heritage of that past. The continuity was never broken. All that, of course, had appeared before when the Tang dynasty unified China in the 7th century. But it was reconfirmed by the Mongols because these were obviously foreigners. And even though after 90 years of their rule, they had actually confirmed that the Liao, Jin, and Song were all part of the continuity of Chinese history. And that record was what is now the Chinese understand to be China. China is based on that continuity of the records. And in fact, it's much stronger than the Qing. The Qing people can argue about, interpret the classics in all sorts of different ways. And Zhu finally gave a kind of imprimatur to the Sishu in the Song dynasty. But apart from that, they could argue about how to interpret the classic. But historical records were not, there was no need for that. These are the records kept as a totality of all records. And I'm not talking about the 24 histories. I'm talking about the whole body of knowledge that was put together by the Qing dynasty, by the Manchus themselves, under Qianlong, in the Siku collection, under Shi. And if you look at what it contains, Shi contains everything about how to rule China, how to govern China, who are the legitimate Tianzi, and everything that the Tianzi stood for was recorded. And they were recorded essentially by Confucian historiographers who did that. That is the continuity. And so let me end now, taking too long, just to finish off. So when the question of empire and nation came up in the 20th century, the question of Qing Shi became a problem. If you say nothing to do with Qing Shi, we are a new country, a republic, how do you start your new country? Now, they didn't start, interestingly enough, they did not start it from 1912 as a completely new phase. What they did was the Chinese historians rewrote their history and determined that Jindai Shi, modern Chinese history, began with the Opium War. Now, that is extraordinary. It's never happened before. That was quite revolutionary. To conceive of the Chinese past, starting from 1840, was inconceivable in the past. But having done that, it did damage to this whole question of what is Chinese history. So very interesting that after that, they struggled with this. The communists had an even greater problem because they inherited a historiography that had nothing to do with the West or China either, which goes back to, as it were, to the Karl Marx's 4 stages of slavery to feudal system, to capitalism, to communism, that kind of reclassification of history. And the communist Chinese historians spent 30, 40 years trying to rewrite history in that frame, which is totally rejected now. Nobody buys that idea at all. So as a result, Chinese face a problem. What is China is because they're unable to come to a real agreement to the sense of continuity. And what we're looking at today is that insofar as the Chinese Communist Party today tries to explain what has happened today, link it up with the Communist Revolution of 1949 under Mao Zedong, and then to link that up with the 1911 revolution of 1912. And now they find to link back further in Jindai Shi, they would have to go back to the Opium War. But this is unsatisfactory. And you find many, many large groups of historians in China are still arguing with the state, with the communist state today, about the need to rewrite Qing Shi. The group that is trying to write Qing Shi is still out there. And they have actually done it, but they have not published it yet. It's quite extraordinary. So you can see how this is still work in progress. I use this to illustrate, because it's only one of many other problems of what is China. I use to illustrate, to say that a dominant system of nation states, which says that all empires might end up by nation states, is one problem of discourse. But that discourse itself determines the shape and all the arguments. Then the argument is China cannot survive as a nation state except as a state of all the Han Chinese. And all the non-Han Chinese, theoretically, they are nations in themselves, and even the Chinese adopted from the Soviet Union the idea of nationalities, which Stalin had used before, and that there were 55 other nationalities in China, confuse the situation even more. So that the idea of Zhonghua Minzu simply doesn't look credible in the eyes of outsiders. And this poses a serious, and I would argue, existential problem to the question of what is China. And this is why this question of relations with China and the United States are hinging on international law concepts of empire and nation, in which the Chinese nation is still being shaped and formed, is not yet settled. And in the course of that, whatever the Chinese do can be reinterpreted insofar as it's going against international law if it does not accept the identities and ethnic rights of all the ethnic groups in China, a very fundamental issue. So it involves wealth and power, it involves law and international law, and it involves ultimately the value of what makes China so distinctive. Very fundamental existential questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wong, for the very informative speech. Now we'll proceed to the moderation segment. So you mentioned that the Opium Wars and Qing treaties were essentially attempts to make China play by international law. And we see a continuum today where the West is still trying to get China to go to the international courts to show up at the negotiation table and respect their rules. So how is China responding to this expectation and pressure?
Well, I think, as you know, if the example is from the South China Sea, and on that one, there are, I think, other problems than simple fundamental questions about international law. It is the Chinese understanding of UNCLOS, what they had signed up to in 1970s. As you know, when the Chinese attended the last meetings of UNCLOS, they had just joined the United Nations, had just been recognized as the legitimate ruling group of China. And the people they sent to that UNCLOS meeting were really just beginning to understand what international law was about. So they were very, very insecure, uncertain what to do. And all they asked for at that time, as I understand it, all they asked for was that all questions of sovereignty were aside. In other words, they would argue about certain rights, economic rights and definitions and so on, but all questions of sovereignty were not to be included in the debates by UNCLOS. So UNCLOS was really about the nature of the sea and what people's rights are off your coast, 12 miles, economic zones and so on, but not sovereignty. And they thought they were protected by setting that aside. And when this issue came up about international court, they said that it touches on sovereignty. You're actually dealing with sovereignty. Therefore, it cannot go to, it's not open to UNCLOS. It is something that all sovereignty issues are between two countries, are bilateral problems between the countries involved in the sovereignty issue. And UNCLOS does not touch on sovereignty. Now, this is arguable. I have no idea. I'm not an international lawyer. I have no expertise in this. But from what I understand, listening to my international law friends who argue about that, but they, of course, they are divided themselves of how strictly we should argue that the UNCLOS can deal with the South China Sea, even if it's not, even if it seemed to cover sovereignty issue by not touching on sovereignty as such, but determining, for example, nature of whether they are islands or not, and if you're an island, how many miles of economic zone. So arguing on very different other points. And the Chinese consider that to be simply an underhand way of touching, dealing with the sovereign issue, which they say is not included under UNCLOS. Now, as I said, this is a debate which I have no ability to determine. But you can see it is an open question in the eyes of the Chinese and a closed question in the eyes of the Americans. And ironically, the Americans have not ratified UNCLOS. So there's one of these peculiarities, which make the Chinese very suspicious of international law. They've always been a bit suspicious of international law because they've always thought of international law as something that was imposed on the Chinese. The Chinese had never had any say in international law. They were devised by the West in the 19th century, and they were brought to China, and that international law was used to undermine the whole of the Chinese defense and commercial system that used the tributary system in the past. So they are themselves very suspicious and not quite sure how to deal with it, except to stay out of the questions of sovereignty. And they've made sovereignty into almost a sacred position from which they argue many other points.
Yep, thank you for that very interesting perspective. Another question that I have is that you mentioned that at the turn of the century, the intellectuals and the nationalists really place a huge emphasis on strengthening China to make it compete with the West. So how has this perception of the need to strengthen itself shaped Chinese nationalism today? And how does China project this nationalist voice on a global stage?
To put it in its simplest way is to say that the Chinese had no enemies from the sea up to the 19th century. If you look at their own history, the enemies have always come from overland, from the Xiongnu down to the Manchu, and everything about their power and wealth has been how to deal with these invaders from the north and the west, the northeast. And the whole system of defense, dealing with foreigners and so on, have really drawn its inspiration from the fact that the enemies all came by land, and at sea there was not a problem. At sea you deal with it mainly for commercial reasons, and since the other people are more interested in trading with China than China trading with them, then it's obvious that the whole system of trade can be linked to a defense system and foreign relations system, which will make China secure. And as long as it's secure, and this system was devised for dealing with the outsiders from the continent, overland, enemies from overland. So the fact that you have enemies coming from the sea, is new to the Chinese. That enemies, not just little enemies, but enemies that could actually help to destroy you, threaten your whole system. In fact, succeeded in threatening and almost destroying the whole system. That, I think, is totally new. And that gives a completely different perspective on the whole thing. And that this, in itself, requires that the Chinese completely reorientate their worldview towards the sea. And today, of course, even more significant, if I may add one other point, and that is that the economic success of the last 40 years under Deng Xiaoping has been that Deng Xiaoping opened up the Chinese economy to maritime trade completely. And in fact, today you would say the economic success in joining the capitalist system was to join the maritime world global economy under the capitalist system had built and through the World Trade Organization and so on. By joining it, they have enabled the Chinese economy to develop so successfully, becoming, as it were, the factory of the world, the fact that their goods are sold everywhere, and most of them go by sea, by far, which 80–90% of that trade is maritime trade. And the economy today is actually dependent on the sea. It's not just a security. So both political and economic security and the existence of China, the modern China, is now based on that sea. So the attitude towards the sea, the attitude towards naval power, the attitude towards naval security has completely changed. And this, of course, means that the whole of the coastal China and the people of the coastal China, particularly the people in the south of the Yangtze, not so much the northerners who used to dominate everything. Today, the thinking is now involving much more the south and how to face the South China Sea as well as the East China Sea to open itself to global relations freely. And in fact, they believe they need freedom of navigation probably more than anybody else.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'll get Professor Poe to give a few comments. before we head into the Q&A segment?
Surely. Thank you, Jackson, and thank you, Serena. Can you hear me properly? Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Right. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening to some of you, because I know that you're probably now on the other side of the globe. But in any case, thanks for being here with us today. And before I say anything else, I mean, let me say that it is a tremendous honor to be invited and to be involved in this very special event, having an invaluable chance to talk to the one and only Professor Wang Gungwu today. And to be perfectly honest, I consider myself winning a very special prize to be given this golden opportunity. So thank you once again to China Forum and the organizers for having me on board. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Wang, not only for your very insightful and timely remarks just now, but also for what you have done for us in the field of Chinese, Asian, and global histories over the past few decades. Even though we can only conduct this event, I mean, over Zoom virtually, I'm sure the audience in this assembly, including myself, would very much like to give you a big round of applause to express our appreciations. You might not hear them now, but because everybody's on mute, but I'm sure the applause is out there. So thank you very much for enlightening us with your very solid, stimulating, and penetrating research. And we're incredibly lucky to have you in the field, and we're truly grateful. So what I'm going to do in the coming 10 to 15 minutes is to perhaps elaborate and comment on some of your very insightful observation that you just made just now. And I'll also make sure to do it quickly, because I'm sure many of us here today would like to interact with Professor Wang more directly in the Q&A section. So I will try to save us more time. But at the same time, I feel like it's not an easy task to cover. I mean, what we have talked about so far, as Professor Wang already mentioned, that because the perimeter of our subject today is pretty wide and extensive. So I guess the best way to handle this is to focus on a few areas emerged from your talk and also the conversation just now, and perhaps we can go through some of the other aspects during the Q&A section, if that's okay. So the first aspect derived from the talk that I would like to talk about is the connection between Western incursions and the late Qing in the 19th century. I think which is also related to the first point raised by Professor Wang just now, wealth and power. I agree that the Western encroachments in the late Qing, played a crucial role in shaping China's internal politics, as well as its road to its so-called modernizations. And I think this kind of dynamic could be distinguished by the classic model proposed by the late John King Fairbank, as we all know him, as the Western impact and China response model. And speaking of this Fairbank model, I'm fully aware that it has been criticized by historians over the past few decades, and it's now even being considered sort of outdated or impractical, because the reason that the Qing Empire underwent a series of dramatic reforms in the 19th century was not only driven by the West, but also by some of its internal problems. Well, I'm not in opposition to this assessment, because I also think that those internal problems in China played a vital role. But I also think that by highlighting those internal domestic factors that pushed the Qing court to readjust its policy doesn't necessarily mean that the impact of those imperialistic incursions from the West was not influential at all. So therefore, I'm in line with some recent historiographies, that those Western forces in the 19th century were not fairly vital, not only fairly vital in shaping the political and governmental outlook of the late Qing, but also the history of China after the Qing Empire collapsed in 1912, especially if we try to look at it from a global perspective, as suggested by Professor Wang, that the perspective which links the history of the colonizers and those being colonized or semi-colonized across time and space. And from here, I would like to move on to the second aspect that I would like to talk about, which is the conceptions of the century of humiliations. I think in which, I guess we are quite obsessed with it. Even until nowadays. I agree totally. With the premise of this event that the Qing Empire doomed itself to an unpreventable collapse. In the face of those Western powers, and also the Japanese. And we all know that. After the First Opium War, the Qing endorsed over 500 unequal treaties in order to resolve, a series of diplomatic disputes and military conflicts, with those imperialistic powers. So it was. There's no question that it was a humiliations or national humiliation for sure, and not only for the Han Chinese, but also for the Qing Empire. But what I want to do is to perhaps try to ask. So what if we try to interpret, the impact of these Western pressures or those unequal treaties, from a less patriotic approach? For example, if we focus on the legal and administrative developments of the late Qing, which could also link to the second point, of the question of law mentioned by Professor Wang just now. So if we focus on these legal developments, I would also argue that to some extent, these unequal treaties also permit the Qing court to fend off foreign intruders and sustain their powers, for almost half a century. And thereby, they were able to maintain their so-called Manchu sovereignty in East Asia. So right here, I think we should also be very careful in differentiating a Han Chinese-centered China and the Qing Empire from a historical point of view. And one more thing that I would like to pay particular attention to, derived from this second point raised by Professor Wang, is that some of the late Qing reforms in its final 2 decades will actually emerge because of those Western influence. And those reforms, also mark a radical departure of the Chinese state, to import foreign models and adapt them to Chinese realities. So therefore, in a sense, the decline of the Qing Empire was incontrovertible. But what we should be reminded is that the late Qing, they established an agenda and a template for reform during the middle of the so-called century of humiliations, that would influence a century of transformation to follow. So let me give you 2 examples. The first one would be the Beijing ministries and the cabinet system of the Beijing government of the early republic were actually a direct continuation of the system created in 1906. And while at the same time, the executive yuan of the Kuomintang government also continued the use of such ministerial systems founded in the late Qing reforms. So as a result, I think we shouldn't overlook these connections between the Qing and the Republic era, which is also highlighted by Professor Wang in his lecture earlier. The final aspect that I would like to elaborate on is the changing connections between the Qing Empire and the PRC nowadays over time. Which is also linked to the questions of national pride made by Professor Wang earlier. Because from a historical perspective, the connection between the Qing and the PRC is quite complicated in my view, because before the 1980s, the PRC didn't really give any substantial recognitions to the Qing Empire, or simply because the Qing was regarded as a victim in Western imperialism, as we already have just briefly talked about. But there was a dramatic change in the 1980s, when the National Academy of Social Sciences adjusted to a new directions in terms of re-examining the Qing history. So at that time, a kind of new model which focuses on building China as a united and multi-ethnic country was the main trend. And because of these new directions, the Communist Party began to break through the so-called humiliation ideologies and decided to acknowledge the Qing greatness in order to consolidate its national pride from history. So because we have long been talking about the 19th century today, but I think we shouldn't forget that the Qing dynasty covered more than 2.5 centuries altogether. And if the 19th century should be regarded as the humiliating century, the 18th century was should be considered a century of prosperity and greatness, especially by the Chinese government. So as a result, the Qing Empire received a completely different treatment from the Chinese Communist Party after the 1980s. A case in point here is that the CCP has decided to seize the mantle of legitimacy by rewriting and publishing new Qing history, which was only completed a few years ago, in which Professor Wang just mentioned that it should be the Republican era that wrote the Qing history, but the PRC decided to rewrite it. And in addition to these publication projects, well, the Chinese government also decided to digitalize all archival materials related to Qing history. And by 2018, according to my statistic there, is that the digitalized images files of these documents were reported to a total of 2 million. And most of them are searchable by metadata. And at the same time, the Chinese government also intends to translate all foreign scholarships on the Qing period, which could run to tens of thousands of titles. So, additionally, a final example that I would like to make is that there were lots of TV dramas productions featuring the Qing dynasty over the last decade. And that's what we call in Chinese the Qing Gongju. And most of them were sponsored by the central government, and the production costs, we all know that were huge. So of course, these are only some of the examples, tips of an iceberg, so showing that China today was committed to reconnect with the Qing Empire more proactively, especially compared to its attitudes towards this dynasty before the 1980s. But only by taking some of these examples into account, I think it already demonstrates that China was very much bounded to a long-standing ideology that is, the present can always be shaped by the past. So having said that, however, how effective these projects could help the Chinese government to achieve its political goal is another matter, and maybe still debatable, I would say. But and more importantly, to what extent these projects could help China to become a superpower in the new century is also worth discussing. And perhaps we can talk more about it during the Q&A section. So anyway, I understand that my time is running short, so I should probably stop here. So here are some of my observations through the speech of Professor Wang today, and I hope they will also help stimulate more question during the Q&A section. And finally, lastly, and on a personal note, and I just want to say thank you once more, Professor Wang, for being with us here today. And may I wish you good health and happiness always. And we'll all need to take good care of ourselves. And I very much hope that we can conduct another seminar or a similar section like this with you to review what we have covered today in 5 or 10 years' time. I'm very much looking forward to it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, Professor Wang, do you want to respond to what Dr. Post said?
If I just have just one or two things to say, and that is that what happened in the 1980s reflects one very simple fact in my view, and that is the total bankruptcy of the historical writings of up to the 1980s. The question of using Marxist, Leninist historiography to rewrite history in terms of the class struggle, as Mao Zedong wanted all of it to be redone, and getting nowhere with that, and having nowhere to turn, because if you reject traditional Confucianism from the Mayfast movement onward, and you reject the West for its liberal capitalism as being fundamentally immoral, and then you reject the Soviet Leninist historiography of rewriting history in terms of the class struggle, and when you reject all that, what have you got left? And I think this is to me the fundamental problem that all the leaders and particularly his advisors who do know their Chinese history realize that something had to be done. And I think the recognition that they have to look back at their own history if they want to make sense of what to do in the future. So my final little remark is simply to say, as you can see from what Professor Ronald Poe was saying, this is still very much work in progress. The Chinese are in the middle of, in a way, once again, re-looking at their past, but re-looking at this time by wanting to link it all up with a great sense of continuity, because this continuity is the only thing left that can give the Chinese their distinctive civilization back.
Yeah. Thank you for that exchange. Now we'll move on to Q&A segment. And I'll start with a question posed by an anonymous audience. Do you think that it is possible to achieve integration of ethnic groups in modern China, like what happened during the Northern and Southern dynasties? If so, how and why?
I think ethnic groups don't necessarily have to integrate in any meaningful way. It's usually what happens is that the elites do that. The elites do that because they want to share power and wealth. So it comes back in a way to the obvious question of Fu and Qiang, not only for a state, but for all the families and elite groups in history. They want to have a share in it. And these are the people who make the compromises, do the negotiations, and rearrange and rewrite history or whatever it is, whatever is necessary to make themselves part of a working system that is proven to be successful and would be respected and to be legitimate. And so the ethnic groups, normally what would happen is that the leader, the elites of any ethnic group would be the first ones to make moves to integrate in one way or the other, while reserving enough of their own identity to remain elites in the eyes of their own people. But the ordinary people don't need to. In fact, all through Chinese history, the ethnic groups and sub-ethnic groups were numerous, probably more than 55. I mean, there were hundreds of them, different groups, and they lived their own lives. And so what we call Han people today, I would say the majority of the Han people today are probably descended from people who 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, would not have been Han. But in the course of the elite groups doing that, and once you do that, then how do you stay being an elite? You become educated. And this is the heart of the Chinese civilization. I didn't want to go into that a lot. The heart of Chinese civilization is the idea of the language. Wen, in the end, ultimately, what is Chinese civilization? It comes from the word wen. It comes from literacy. It comes from having a particular writing system and the recognition that this writing system gives you a sense of unity. Everybody can read the same language, doesn't matter what they speak, what religion they believe in, or whatever ideas they may have. But if they can read the same language and they communicate through that language, then they actually belong to the same cultural society. And I think this, in the end, this is what matters. The sub-ethnic groups have always been there. In fact, I'm always amazed when we did a linguistic atlas some decades ago, where we found pockets of people in the middle of different other groups who spoke a particular dialect or a particular language of their own for centuries, and they're still doing that. But in other ways, they may well be, the elites are people who can take the examinations and go to Beijing and serve the empire. So there's no contradiction there. You can, as it were, keep all your local cultural values and all your local practices and rituals, and at the same time be Chinese in the sense that you use the same language, and your elite groups are identified as respected as an equal among all the elite groups because they use that same language and can perform in the same way.
Thank you. We have another question from Peter. So, Professor Wang, I assume that you would agree that the People's Republic of China is the successor state to the Republic of China. So how do you see the immersion of Marxism, Leninism related to this idea of Han states and its bearings in today's issue? And how does China deal with this very complicated past of both Qing and the Republic? How do they pick and choose the side of history in present favor?
I think the major choices were made at the beginning of the 20th century when they wanted to be part of the world of progress. The idea of progress was probably the most successful idea from the West that the Chinese took almost without any doubt whatsoever. They loved the idea because all through Chinese history, the idea was you look to the glorious golden age of the past and that's a standard by which you measure all the developments, how far you have departed from it, how far you're no longer perfect, as it was once in the golden age, and so on. But the idea of progress was no, the wonderful golden age is in the future, and that we can all progress towards that future. And this is inevitable because now we have science, we have modern economics, we have modern industrial capitalism and socialism. All these new ideas are actually pointers to that future, which is progressive and will go on making progress. That idea, of course, lots of the young people got it from Marx, but it's actually not invented by Marx. It was invented in the 18th century by the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment period in France and parts of Europe, that they had worked out the idea that the moderns and the ancients, the moderns were definitely better than the ancients, that this idea that you made progress. And once that idea was proven to be true by the scientists, technologists, and the capitalists, and this was the country got richer, you produce more, people have greater wealth, more material benefits, then science and technology confirmed in a very persuasive way that progress was inevitable, is possible. Once you believe that, then your whole worldview totally changes. And that is why, in terms of the Chinese today, it doesn't matter whether you call it Marxist, Leninist, or whatever you call it. They believe in progress. And they say that this is proven today. That is why when the modernization is all about progress. And now that they have modernized themselves, they have in fact modernized themselves in almost every way you can think of, with a few exceptions, those that touch upon some fundamental core ideals of what they consider to be their heritage of for example, hierarchy, a sense of hierarchy, the importance of the family, still vaguely there, although it's not as strong as before, and the idea that social and collective interests are superior to your individual selfish interests. These are still very fundamental things which still remain in deeply rooted in the Chinese ethos. And I would say that these are things which they would like to preserve, and therefore they hesitate against anything that would bring about, to their minds, a breakdown of order, anarchy, chaos, and so on, and rebellions, and all the protests that they go on. They are basically afraid of that. They don't want to go to that. They think that that is destructive and that's ultimately bring about weakness and division in China again. So these are quite deep-rooted ones, and they go back a long time. They are not new ideas. These are very deep ones in the whole, linking up the whole of Chinese history. So once you do that, then you say, yes, that links up to the past. So there was a glorious past, which we mustn't forget, but the future is even more glorious. And who gave us the idea of the glorious future? And they picked on Karl Marx. The kind of Confucius being the sage of the past, Karl Marx is the sage of the present. Both are relevant to Chinese history, past, present, and future, and that we should not deny either of them. But looking into the future, Karl Marx, not Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism per se, but the idea of progress as personified by Karl Marx, who at least in terms of the canon of socialism, is still someone who's basically a scholar, who did no personal harm to anybody, who never had any power, or usurped power, or was dictator or authoritarian, whatever it was. His hands are not bloody, as it were. Quite safe to have him as a philosopher who gave them an idea of a future that is better than the present. And to believe in that, I think, is what keeps the Chinese going today. Very much optimistic. Of course, the Chinese have always been somewhat more optimistic all through their history. But this now gives them an optimism about making progress, which the whole society is now committed to. Of course, it's mainly material progress they're talking about, but nevertheless, it's progress as they understand it. And I think they are actually dedicated to that. They actually genuinely believe that. In a way, I think no other people quite so religiously believe in progress as the Chinese people today.
Professor Wang, actually, I have a small question regarding the framework that you are saying. Several other scholars, such as Professor Zheng Yongnan, also mentioned that one of the problems that the world finds it hard to understand China, or China finds it hard to understand the world, is that when the world look at China in terms of when we talk about the aspect of international relations, they are all using the Western theories, liberalism, realism, all that. But the Chinese, they themselves do not have their own international relation theory. Do you think that problem also persists in the making of history, the history theories? As you mentioned that the Mao Zedong tried to use the Marxist tradition to explain the Chinese history, but it failed. So do you foresee the upcoming of a Chinese version of history theories to explain themselves?
That's a good question. And I know that a lot of my friends have been engaged in trying to work out a Chinese international relations theory. I'm not sure that they have been successful, and I'm not sure that it matters all that much. I mean, the point is that theory is only a means of thinking about something. And as I understand it, the Chinese tradition, going right back, has never been placed emphasis on theory. They have been basically a very practical, pragmatic people who, if you look at their whole history, is somewhat like that. In one sense, you might say this is one of the weaknesses of the Chinese tradition, that they have no great tradition of theorizing. In fact, what we understand by theory is really something that developed out of science. It is modern science in the 17th and 18th century in Europe that began to really make theory into a kind of sacred thing that one must aim at. Of course, they have a tradition. When you go back to Plato and Aristotle in the Greco-Roman tradition, they have already some idea of the importance of ideas and systems of ideas as a guiding way of guiding you towards getting things done. The Chinese have never quite emphasized that. If you read who do they respect most? Confucius and all the people, his disciples. And even among the legalists and the other so-called philosophers, the thinkers of the Zhangguo period, I mean, much of it, you can say, are very practical ideas, how to do better, how to improve government, how to be a better ruler, how to gain more peace, be successful against another state, and all these. But very little of it, I think, can be described as anything like theory. And it is one of the reasons why for a long time, and even today, Western philosophers say the Chinese don't have philosophy. They have thought, ideas for practical, how to do certain things, but always linked to something that needed to be done today, a problem that needs to be solved right now or in the immediate future, but nothing in terms of a kind of universal theory. I mean, of course, there are some assumptions of universality in Chinese ideas of morality and so on. But even when they try to define that, you find they always argue in terms of it being natural and being human and being understandable in human terms. I'll give you an example. Why do the Chinese, for thousands of years, place so much emphasis upon the idea of family? I mean, Europeans have family, everybody else has family. But why do the Chinese make it such an important point? And you listen to Confucius and Mencius, what they argue from is very simple. It's not a theory. It's simply that family is the most natural relationship. The father, mother, and child is a natural relationship. And this must be the starting point of anything to do with human beings. And this, very simple, you can say it's an assumption, it's a premise, but it's not a theory. And they don't develop a great theory out of it, but they, in practical terms, developed a great institution, the family, genealogical, kinship systems that have developed over the 2,000 years into something so elaborate that all the genealogies that people write by the Qing period, the genealogies go longer and longer. And some of it is almost kept as a kind of family secret to determine who you are. And they go that far. In some ways, it is very ancient. There's nothing new. You can find it in the Old Testament, who you're descended from and so on. But it's a way they institutionalize that whole thing is a kind of build a whole system on a fundamental assumption. And that is, I think, how the Chinese approach it, not by theories. And since they don't have the tradition, the efforts today to try and find a tradition, that they find it rather unnatural. It's not their natural way of doing things. Instead of which, what they want to learn, they learn enough theory for their scientific purposes, but science is also still an instrument of improvement, an instrument to progress, a means by which you can become better and have a future that is greater than the past. So even then, it has pragmatic purposes. It is useful. It is valuable for that reason. And whether it needs a theory or not, well, you may have found a theory, I'll use it. But if it works for me, I'll use it. If it doesn't work, I'll move on to something else. So the attitude is such that it's not a question of my finding a better theory than your theory. It's a question whether whatever there is given to me, whether it works or not. If it works, I'll adopt it. If it doesn't work, I'll reject it and try something else. But this is, I think it's a deeper philosophical question that I can't go into. But you can see there is a contrast between artificially trying to build theory, and it doesn't come naturally. And I find my Chinese friends finding it rather difficult. Maybe in science, fundamental science, maybe through mathematics and science, physics and chemistry, they may come to that eventually. But right now, they're still that doesn't come naturally to them.
Thank you. Our next question is by George. If we look back in time, we can find an intersection amongst the ideas of race, nation, and ethnicity. So when racial ideas are essentially associated to West centrism and pseudoscience that are under criticism, is it still necessary to seek nation as a source of legitimacy?
Well, I think whether we like it or not, it's here to stay. Once it was invented in the 18th century and became more and more universal in the West in the 19th century, 19th and 20th century, and then became global after 1945, we have now found that it is a very useful way of organizing a larger group than a tribe. I mean, otherwise you have all kinds of little tribes, and in the past, everybody went through a tribal stage. All humans did that. But people have graduated from the tribal stage. They've moved on to monarchies, oligarchies of one kind or the other, to empires, to imperialism. And they've gone through all that. And now, in the last 50, 60 years, I think it has been accepted as probably the best we can do. And it is actually extremely valuable for small countries, because a small country protected by the idea that all nations are equal depends on that argument very much for their survival. Because if they did not have it, they would be immediately swallowed up or become part of the empires of power or more powerful people. So sovereignty protected by international law of the idea of national identity is something that is very valuable for the small and middle-sized countries. It is for the great powers that is not so useful, because when they are great powers, then if they sound nationalistic, whether it's American or Chinese nationalism, it's pretty frightening, because when you're that powerful and you talk in nationalistic terms, it's quite a different effect on people. But when you're a small country, nationalism is a way of defending yourself. I find that, in fact, morally understandable, and I'm very sympathetic to a small. So whether you're small or big probably determines how much you appreciate nationalism. Now, when powerful countries use nationalism, and then it will be perceived as being the preliminary to the kind of national empires that I said came out of the 1800 to 19th century, when something new, the national empires came to being. But the world recognized by the end of the Second World War that all these nations trying to be empires was an absolutely destructive approach towards human society. And in the end, 2 world wars was really to settle that issue. No more national empires. At least that was what you find the discussion about. But then after that, how do you protect nation states forever and forever as states of equality and sovereign rights respected by all? And this is something I think as a value in today's terms, I would say very important. And I can see from the point of view of small and medium countries, absolutely something we must preserve. But I don't know that we want to see it coming from a big country, a powerful country.
Thank you. Today, actually, we have another guest with us.
Dr. Tian from the East Asian Institute. He would also like to ask one question. Dr. Tian, please.
Thanks, Professor Wang. Thanks, Professor Paul, for very interesting discussions, and thanks for organizers for having me here. And just one more example of this, a similar example to Xinjiang, this China's historical maps. So how do you draw the historical maps for those regimes? Based on currently we understand our understanding of territory states. So that's another similar dilemma scholars in China face. So I have two questions for Professor Wang. One is this, you mentioned a lot about this idea of progress. So my understanding, in political science literature, people talk about China as a developmental state. Try to increase, material richness for the people. So is that could be something linked between empire and my interpretation is something linked between empire and nation state. But China tried to justify the multinational states by its ability to improve people's welfare, improve the material richness. That's one question. So is that the way to theoretically to link those two ideas? The other question I'm thinking is you mentioned missionary during the speech. So missionary actually started to visit China in later Ming dynasty. During that period, a lot of intellectuals, as our country intellectuals, these people very keen to learn missionaries, knowledge about science, knowledge about geography. So during that time, a lot of ideas, people talking about 东海西海其理犹同. So people also try to integrate the Western thoughts and the Chinese philosophies during that time. So compare current efforts. We link to current efforts to people try to link the domestic legacy of Chinese philosophy and with the international relations theories. Why? How to understand? From those missionary and Chinese intellectuals precedent example, the Ming dynasty's intellectuals failed to link those two traditions. So what we can learn from those from those people, their failed efforts to link the Western science and knowledge with Chinese philosophy? Thank you.
Those are very good questions. For the first one, it's a very big question, but let me just try and simplify it and put it this way. The fact that the Chinese are trying to use the phrase a multinational state is to show that they have accepted the word nation from the West in a way we should not help them, because the idea of a multinational state, so far anyway, hasn't really caught on anywhere else. And the people suspect the Chinese of using it to justify what they've inherited from the Qing Empire. So that's the problem. The Chinese using multinational is a word that never existed in the past. So they've, in effect, adopted the Western discourse to try and justify what they're doing. And by so doing, they're actually undermining their own argument. That's what I would say. But I'm keep it brief. I can go into that later on if we have time. The second point is much more profound. As I suggested, when the Jesuits came, they did not threaten China. They came with new ideas, offering new ideas, willing to learn from the Chinese. In fact, how extraordinary how many of those Jesuits mastered the Chinese classics and used Chinese to explain what they were trying to do. And what they were offering was new knowledge. And the Chinese are impressed with it. If this is new, and this is interesting, and it's convincing, and it actually shows, in a way, progress. It's actually better than what we had before, like measuring the calendar or better maps and so on. We're willing to learn from you. And you're no threat to us. They came open hands. No army, navy, governments, foreign diplomats coming down your throat to say, you cannot touch them, they're sacred. Nobody said that. They were there and they established themselves by being genuinely wise, genuinely having something to offer the Chinese, And the Chinese were very willing to learn. Of course, there were some conservative types who didn't want to accept it because of the question of Christianity. They didn't accept that, but they accepted that new knowledge. And today I would say that would still be the same. If they found that the new knowledge is actually beneficial to China, like I say, science and technology, no question, probably more technology than science. But once they learn the skill, once they know that that skill is a tremendous benefit to us, that skill, whether it's in science or it's in finance, capitalist investment, and setting up major enterprises, they will learn with great willingness and tremendous speed, and there's no hesitation whatsoever when it comes to it. In other words, it's new and it benefits China, benefits me, and I want to master it, and so on. And they've been doing that. Now this is where, if you talk in the abstract, we must have a better theory. The Chinese need to be convinced that a better theory is that important. But whereas they're easily convinced that a better way of getting a fast train or express highway, how to build it and so on, you don't have to tell them twice. Once they see it, they want to do it. Once they show you a new way of doing things which is better than your old way, they will do it. And you look at how quickly the Chinese have learned from the West. Whatever they think would benefit the country or themselves, they make their fortunes, they will do it without hesitation. But they're not quite convinced that theory in itself, or the brilliant philosophical idea by itself, is of any immediate importance to them, and they may not be so interested. And some of these abstract ideas, they don't come naturally to the Chinese. And the theory is not always proven to the Chinese to be immediately useful to them. In that way, the tradition is still basically empirical, pragmatic, and not inclined towards the intellectual exercises that theoretical work demands. And this, I think, is still a gap there. Maybe the Chinese will overcome it. One day they'll all be persuaded. If you look at the work of social sciences in China, it's fascinating. I mean, there was no such thing as social science in China. I mean, of course, there was no such thing in China and in the West either. It really came out of science. It is an offshoot of science as applied to study of humanity and societies. And the West developed it using the principles drawn from scientific research. And the Chinese have taken the science, particularly in its technology and economic side, but when it applies to other things pertaining to human society, to culture, to values, to ethics and morality, even to law and so on, they don't see quite where the theory really helps them. At least they have not been convinced, and I cannot think of any Chinese who have really been excited by theoretical questioning of this part of the social sciences pertaining to human society. They have, on the contrary, the heritage is that they have a certain wisdom about human society, which derives from Confucian and other thinkers of the past, which is still valid. And insofar as they are valid, they should be retained. If they are not valid, they've been rejected. Some aspects of their old ideas have been totally rejected by the young people today, quite understandably and rightly. But where they've not been rejected by the society as a whole, then they need to be persuaded that they should be rejected. And if you think a theory is needed to reject these ideas successfully, they may want to do that. But I don't think they have been convinced that you need a theory to do that. And if it works, let us retain it. If it's good for us, making us comfortable, making us feel proud that we are Chinese, and we're not going to be Americans or Europeans or Africans and so on. We are Chinese. And in that sense of pride in their heritage is something you can say is irrational, but it's very deep. This is where I think I would call deep structures of value systems. And these deep structures are not easy to change, and you need to have a good reason to change them. And I think where it comes to theory, the Chinese have not been convinced that theory is that crucial to what they want to do. And they have shown in their practice, the way they've done what they've done in the last 40 years, is extraordinary what they have done. They simply mastered all the technical things, technological and practical ways of doing things, managerial and so on, administrative and so on, improved on all of them and taken off. And they're even more convinced that that's the way to do it. I mean, Did we need any new theories? I'm not sure that anything that the Chinese have achieved in the last 40 years came from a new theory. They actually just took what was done, mastered the skills and techniques necessary, and through those new methods achieved great successes. And I think to them, that is evidence that that's the way to go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Two of our audience members, both Chonghua and Jinxiang, have asked a question about the concept of tianxia. So do you foresee that the concept of tianxia will be integrated into Chinese historical study in the future?
Well, frankly, the Chinese themselves have never really agreed exactly what tianxia means. I mean, there are many interpretations of tianxia. For myself, as a historian, I would say the original idea of tianxia was actually a very vague idea, which was just a general idea of the world as we know it. And it has no boundaries, it has no definition. It's just a sense of the source of authority, like a mandate of heaven, kind of a superior source, which we can't define it, but it is there, and it justifies what we do, because if we do and it's successful, that's because Tian approves of it. Once you start with that kind of cosmic explanation of human motivation and human nature and so on, then the idea of tianxia is a set of practical rules which everybody understands to be improving ourselves, making ourselves better. And you notice that all those ancient heroes that were named as sovereigns and so on, they all invented something or other. They all attributed to have discovered this or discovered that. And everything that makes us more civilized and makes us better organized and so on. So always measured by some very useful, valuable contribution to our society becoming a little bit more civilized and cultured. So that's how they see it. Tianxia then became understood as whoever is the Tianzi, they had to invent that as well. The Son of Heaven was obviously approved of by heaven because he's successful. And there, whatever authority he wields, all those that come under that authority is tianxia. Doesn't have a geographical definition. It doesn't have any spatial limits and so on. But then he gradually, they try to give a shape and form to it. And eventually, through the Zhou period, the Chunqiu Zhanguo period, warring states, as they fought each other all that time, in the name of Tianzi, the Son of Heaven, whereas nobody obeyed him anyway. Nobody listened to him. Nobody cared for him. They all fought among themselves from Chunqiu to the warring states until finally Qin Shi Huang unites the whole place together under Qin. And what then happens becomes very important. Qin Shi Huang called it the tianxia. In other words, he called his empire the tianxia. And after that, if you look at the historical records from Shiji down to the present, everyone who became an emperor called the territory that he controlled his tianxia. He used it. That's the language of the rhetoric of the court. Whoever is emperor talked about his tianxia. Then that word became caught up with whatever you can control. And then, of course, then they found this is not very satisfactory. There are also other people who are connected in other ways. You may not have bureaucrats controlling them for you, but they have a relationship with you, a kind of feudal relationship where they send you tribute to show that they're friendly. And you give them a gift back, exchange of gifts to establish a relationship. And if you're prepared to have that relationship, you're part of the tianxia. So the tianxia spread further and further as relationships between non-Chinese people and the Chinese people became more and more complex. More and more people wanted to have relationships. So the word was sort of extended. But if you actually think about it, at no point did anybody define what is tianxia. The one difference was that it was not the Roman Empire. That what we can say, what tianxia is not. Tianxia is not a Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was expansionist, territorial, and it had very specific militarily defined existence. Tianxia was, even Qin Tianxia was not a Roman Empire. It was linked up with the Confucian sense of vague authority. It's really linked up with relationships which are partly feudal in a vague sense, of relationship between rulers, but not defined, and has gradations. It's a hierarchy of relationships. All that was taken for granted as being natural, depending on how far away you are from me, how big you are, how small you are, how strong you are, how weak you are. And all kinds of relationships can develop. In that context, as a wide sense of Tianxia was set side by side with the Tianxia as the emperor's territory, whether it's Qin Shi Huang or Han Wudi or Tang Taizong, they had a Tianxia. And even the little states, very brief little states, when you read their language, whoever calls himself emperor will talk about his Tianxia. And it could be very, very small. I mean, even the Song, the southern Song at its weakest, was only a small part of China today. But in the eyes of the southern Song emperors, they had their Tianxia, challenged by the Jurchens and the Tanguns and the Mongols, but it was their Tianxia. So you can see it's all very vague. But what I think why people are attracted by that is that it is not an empire. That's one. At the same time, it is not caught up with this question of nationality either. It's not a nation, it's not an empire. It is a vague concept which gives China room to perceive itself or redefine itself in a way that they can recognize China as distinctive. And I think I can understand that, but it's very hard to put that in terms which could fit into the dominant discourse by historians and by political scientists, other social scientists today about the international global system. It just doesn't fit. And so I think this is a fundamental contradiction there, that you can use it in a vague sort of way, but it does not really get around the problems in the dominant discourse, that you were once an empire, and now all empires must go away and disappear and be replaced by nation states. Now that is the dominant discourse. When you read the whole historiography of Eurocentric historiography, as well as the historiography accepted by many countries today, using the word nation, they would say that, yes, we are the products of empires because we finally got rid of empires. And all empires must be replaced by nation states. And in that context, China is found to be wanting, because they say, you really inherited an empire, so something is wrong. It's unfinished business. So it's now become the duty of some countries outside China to say that this is unfinished business, and the business must be finished by cleaning up this last empire, reducing it to a number of nation states. And this is, I think, quite very much on the minds of quite a few historians that I know of.
Thank you, Professor Wang. In the interest of time, we'll be ending our event very soon. So thanks everyone for the questions you have posed. These are very high quality questions, and we are genuinely amazed at the level of engagement and the quality of the questions. So thank you, Professor Po. Thank you, Professor Wang. If you have any last words, please feel free to say out. Yeah, so great. Thanks everyone for attending, and I'll be sharing our contact on stream. Feel free to follow us. Yeah, feel free to follow the China Forums on our social media platforms and stay tuned for more events. If you have any questions directed at any one of our panelists, feel free to email them. Their emails are available on their school's website. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.
哎，他们都走了，我靠！
呀，他们全都走了，可是还是有100多人。呀，
那我们走了，我也走了，拜拜。嗯。